The hatching had not lost a homeworld in 9,000 cycles. This was not arrogance. It was arithmetic. The hatching did not send soldiers to die for territory. It sent biomass, calculated down to the kilogram, against worlds whose defenses had already been mapped by scout broods, whose populations had already been modeled, whose breaking points had already been found. War to the hatching was not a contest. It was a harvest schedule. Earth had been on that schedule for 40 cycles. Tavasha of the Ninth Swarm had never seen the calculations herself. Drones like her were not given access to strategic projections, but she had heard the mother voice hum its satisfaction through the hive link more than once when the word Terra surfaced in the command threads. A soft planet, a young species, bipedal, slow-breeding, technologically adolescent. The kind of world the hatching usually took with a single coordinated landing and a week of mop-up. She drifted in her berth aboard the Severance, one of 40,000 identical drones in cryostasis racks stacked floor to ceiling in the swarm hold, and she did what she always did in the dark between worlds. She listened to the hive hum and waited to be needed. She had heard things about Earth, and the gaps between sleep cycles, fragments passed drone to drone through the hive link the way gossip moves through any species that thinks together. That Earth's allies, the VRN, the long-eared oxytraders, the silent Myrick who communicated only in scent, had all warned the hatching's outer scouts away from human space for cycles now, quietly. Almost embarrassed about it, the way you'd warn a guest not to touch a stove, rather than explain why the stove was dangerous. The mother voice had not listened. The mother voice never listened to small species talking about other small species. It had its calculations. It had its harvest schedule. Tavasha didn't think about that warning again until the Severance dropped out of the threadways. 300,000 kilometers from a blue and white world, and the orbital defense grid, lit up like the whole planet, had opened its eyes at once. She felt it before she understood it, a ripple through the hive link, 40,000 drones startling awake in their racks within the same half-second. The mother voice's hum spiking into something sharp and unfamiliar. Alarm. The hatching did not feel alarm. The hatching felt appetite and calculation, and occasionally correction, when a sub-swarm underperformed. It did not feel this. Tavasha's berth hissed open, and she dropped into the assembly corridor with the rest of her brood cluster, her chitin still cold from stasis, her 4 eyes adjusting to the hold's dim red battle light. Around her, drones were chittering against each other in confusion. Not panic. The hatching didn't panic, but something close to its insect cousin, disorientation. The orbital scans were filling the overhead display lattice, and even Tavasha, who understood almost nothing of strategy, could read the shape of what she was seeing. Human ships, hundreds of them. Not the handful the scout broods had reported. Not the minimal orbital presence, recommend immediate landing, assessment that had gone out to the whole swarm fleet 6 cycles ago. Hundreds, and they were already moving. Why didn't the scouts see this? A drone named Scarret hissed beside her, mandibles clicking with a nervous rhythm that meant he was translating hyostatic into something like speech for her benefit. Scarret always did that. He liked talking even when no one was required to listen. They saw what was meant to be seen, Tavasha said, and didn't know where the thought came from, only that it felt true the way some thoughts did right before the mother voice confirmed them. The mother voice confirmed it 4 seconds later, hive-wide, blunt and absent of the usual harvest satisfaction. Deception detected. Adjust, adjust, adjust. The swarm fleet had been shown a smaller Earth, a weaker one, and the real one had just turned to face them with its teeth out. The landing order came anyway. This was the part T. Kavasha would later understand. Lying in a Texas drainage ditch with half her brood cluster cooling around her as the single greatest miscalculation in 9,000 cycles of hatching history. The mother voice did not abort. It could not. The harvest schedule had no provision for retreat, only for correction, and correction meant committing harder, sending the landing broods down through the chaos, exactly as planned, trusting that ground superiority would still hold, even if orbital superiority had been a lie. So the drop pods launched anyway. 40,000 of them screaming down through an atmosphere that should have belonged to the hatching within the hour, while above them human warships and hatching war spires traded fire in a silence Tavasha couldn't hear from inside her pod, but could feel as a constant shuddering vibration, like the world itself had a heartbeat and it was racing. She hit ground in a place the orbital maps called Texas, a flat brown country stretching to a horizon that seemed to go on without end. Hot wind smelling of dust, and something green and growing that her chemoreceptors had no hatching word for. The pods hatched blue. She unfolded into daylight with her brood cluster fanning out beside her in the standard harvest formation. Fine structures, fine concentrations of soft tissue biomass, secure signal, wait for the processing broods. There was a house 200 meters away. White, low, a covered porch, a faded flag hanging still in the heat. Standard structure, standard target. The first shot took Skarit's head off before Tavasha even registered the muzzle flash from the porch. She would spend the rest of her life, what was left of it, trying to understand what happened over the following 9 hours, and she would never fully manage it, because the hatching had no framework for what Earth actually was. The scout reports had said low weapons saturation among civilian population, comparable to median harvested world. This was, Tavasha understood much later, technically true and catastrophically incomplete. The way it would be technically true to say a hurricane is comparable in size to a small storm if you only measured it at the very center of the eye. The house with the flag had 3 occupants, and she would learn 11 firearms. The house's neighbors had more, and the neighbors' neighbors, and the gas station 4 kilometers down the flat brown road, and the grain co-op, and the diner, and the high school where a teacher named nothing Tavasha would ever know how to pronounce had broken into a supply closet that turned out to be a converted armory because the town's emergency planning committee had, 6 years prior, decided that if anyone was going to invade their county, they were going to have a real bad time of it. Every one of these places erupted into resistance within minutes of the first drop pods touching down, with the speed and coordination that no harvest model had ever accounted for because no harvest model had ever needed to. The hatching took worlds by overwhelming the capacity to resist. It was built, hive and bone, around the assumption that resistance was a finite resource that could be exhausted, mapped and consumed faster than it could regenerate. Texas did not have a finite capacity to resist. Texas had a culture built, for reasons 300 years deep that Tavasha would never understand and didn't have time to ask about, around the assumption that a fight might show up on your porch on any given Tuesday, and you should be ready for it. She watched from behind an overturned harvester combine that smelled of diesel and cut grain, as a vehicle she would later learn was called a deer truck, came tearing down a service road with 4 humans standing in its open bed, one of them firing what her targeting sense identified as an anti-materiel weapon, clearly never designed for civilian ownership, but very obviously owned, anyway, by a civilian who put 3 rounds through a hatching transport pod's hull seam with the kind of accuracy that should have required military training, and apparently, on this planet, did not. Adjust, adjust, the hive link kept saying, and Tevasha realized was something that in another species would have been called dread, that the mother voice had no adjustment to give. There was no harvest doctrine subroutine for the food fights back with deer rifles and tractor parts. By the second hour, brute cluster cohesion had collapsed across the whole landing zone. Tevasha's hive link, once a steady warm hum of 40,000 minds moving as one intention, had become a chaotic flood of contradictory threat reports, each isolated drone cluster screaming its own local catastrophe into a collective consciousness that had no central authority left capable of making sense of it. Structure designated diner. Resistance encountered. Sustained losses requesting reassignment. Structure designated high school. Civilian counter assault. Casualties severe. Requesting air support. Air support unavailable. Orbital engagement ongoing. All spires committed. Tevasha pressed herself flat against the combine's cooling metal frame and watched the sky. Far above, threading between thin afternoon clouds, she could see the contrails of human atmospheric fighters carving impossible turns. Weapons fire she couldn't hear, but could see as flickers of light catching the undersides of hatching transport craft and turning them into slow, tumbling fireballs. It was, despite everything, beautiful in a way she had no proper words for. The hatching aesthetic sense was built around efficiency. A successful harvest was beautiful, the way a clean equation was beautiful. This was the opposite of that. This was chaos given form, brutal and bright, and utterly without economy, and some traitorous corner of her mind that had never been required to think for itself before found itself transfixed by it anyway. She did not have long to watch it. The grain co-op, she would learn, sat at the center of a road junction that her brood commander had flagged hours earlier as a priority structure. High biomass density, agricultural storage easily converted to a processing point, and the order to take it had gone out before anyone realized what the co-op actually was on a day like this one, a rally point. Tevasha's reassigned cluster came up the access road in standard wedge formation, 12 drones moving low and fast between rows of parked combines, and what met them was not the scattered, fleeing biomass the harvest doctrine promised. It was a firing line. Later she would learn the names for what she saw, secondhand, the way she learned most human things. A man named Eustace, who ran the co-op and had, in the chaos of the first hour, simply opened the gun locker behind the feed counter and started handing out whatever was in it to whoever walked through the door. No questions about training or steady hands, because there wasn't time for questions. A retired Army mechanic named Reyes, who had set up a deer rifle on a sandbagged window ledge and was calling out range corrections to a teenager 3 trucks down, like he'd been doing it his whole life because, as it turned out, he very nearly had. 3 sisters, all under 20, who had grown up blinking cans off a fence post every summer of their lives and discovered on this particular Tuesday that the skill transferred with horrifying efficiency to drones moving at a dead run across open gravel. The wedge formation broke in under 90 seconds. Tavasha went down behind an irrigation trough, ears, or the closest hatching equivalent, the vibration-sensing membranes along her thorax, ringing with the concussive crack of rifle fire that never seemed to stop, never seemed to need to reload, as truck after truck of fresh shooters rolled in off the county road to relieve whoever was running low. This is not a defended structure, she thought, lying flat with grain dust settling in the seams of her chiton. This is a structure that simply has more guns than we expected, and the ones holding them are not afraid to use all of them at once. A pickup truck, battered, sun-faded, a bumper sticker on the back she would never be able to translate, came around the corner of the grain silo with a man standing in the bed, bracing a weapon against the roll bar, and for one suspended half-second Tavasha understood with total clarity that the entire hatching doctrine of overwhelming force assumed the other side ran out of will before it ran out of ammunition. Texas, this particular Tuesday, appeared to have an oversupply of both. She survived the co-op only because her cluster commander called the withdrawal. Before the position was fully encircled, one of the last coherent tactical decisions Tavasha would hear given over the hive link before the static of 40,000 separate. Desperate situations drowned out anything resembling a unified strategy. They fell back through the wheat the way they'd come, 3 drones lighter than they'd arrived, and somewhere behind them she could hear, even without the membrane sense, the ragged, exhausted cheer of people who had just held a grain co-op against an alien invasion with deer rifles and a feed store gun locker, and fully intended to do it again the next time anyone came up that road. A hand, no, a boot, kicked the combine's frame 2 meters from her head, and Tavasha's body reacted before her mind caught up, scrambling sideways into the wheat. The human standing over her was small, smaller than Tavasha by half a meter, soft-bodied, in the way her species briefings had described. No natural armor, no claws worth mentioning, nothing about the anatomy that should have made this a contest at all. She had a shotgun, and she did not hesitate, and Tavasha understood. In the half-second it took the human to rack the slide A, second time after the first shot had already taken most of her left mandible off, that this was the part of the briefing nobody on the scout teams had thought to flag as important. The humans do not calculate whether they can win before they decide to fight. The second shot didn't kill her. The third one, from somewhere behind the woman, an older human, gray-haired, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had clearly expected this exact moment for most of his life, did. The hours between the shotgun and the silence were the part Tavasha would never be able to describe properly, not even to herself, not even years later when she had the vocabulary for it. She drifted in and out of the wheat field dark, and in the gaps between waking she caught pieces of the hive links collapse the way a drowning swimmer catches pieces of a shoreline, too fast, too fragmented, gone before they met anything. Brood 14, structure designated diner. Hostile combatants include non-combat registered juveniles. Recommend doctrine update. Negative. Juveniles do not factor into resistance models. Repeat assault. Juveniles are factoring into resistance models. That is the doctrine update. She understood, drifting, that somewhere a sub-commander was trying to explain to the mother voice that the youngest humans on this planet were not the soft, undefended biomass the harvest doctrine assumed. that a structure called a 4-H barn, whatever that was, had produced 24 armed adolescents who knew the local terrain better than any scout brood ever could, and had used that knowledge to turn a routine processing sweep into an ambush that cost an entire transport wing.
Query: source of juvenile weapon proficiency. Source: this is apparently normal here. That is not a doctrinally acceptable answer. There is no doctrinally acceptable answer, sir. They've all been doing this their whole lives. The grandmother at the gas station hit a moving pod from 400 meters, and she is approximately 104 years old by their calendar. Tavasha drifted further, and when she surfaced again, it was full dark, and the quality of the hive link had changed. It was not panicking anymore. It had gone past panic into something the hatching had no name for, because no hatching commander had ever needed one. The slow, grinding recalculation of a species discovering all at once that every model it had ever built of the universe was missing a variable, and that variable had a face, and several 100 million of those faces were currently reloading. She thought, in the strange, clear way thoughts sometimes arrive right before consciousness gives out entirely. The scout reports again. Minimal orbital presence. Comparable weapon saturation. Standard harvest protocol recommended. Some scout brood, cycles ago, skimming past this system on a routine survey, had looked at Earth and seen exactly what they expected to see. Because that was what scouting was for, confirming the model, not breaking it. Nobody had asked the obvious, foolish, unmodeled question. Nobody had asked what the planet looked like on a day when nothing was being measured. Nobody had asked what was sitting in the gun safe in the spare bedroom, or hanging on the rack behind the seat of the truck, or stacked in ammunition cans in 100 million basements and barns and hall closets. Quietly, the way you keep a fire extinguisher you hope you never have to use. The hatching had modeled Earth's military. It had never thought to model Earth's closets. She passed out again before she could finish the thought, and when she woke, the hive link was gone. And the only sound left in the world was the wind moving through wheat that didn't care, one way or the other, who had won. Tavasha did not die. The hatching's drones rarely died cleanly. Their physiology was built for resilience over comfort, and the shot had taken the lower half of her thorax shell without reaching the central nerve cluster. She lay in the wheat field as the light shifted gold and then orange, and then the deep bruised purple of evening. Hive link fading in and out, catching fragments. Brood 9 reporting 0 effective combat capacity. Orbital spires at 40%, requesting immediate. Mother voice, requesting authorization to... And then, hours later, in the dark, the hive link went quiet in a way it had never gone quiet in Tavasha's entire service life. Not destroyed, not jammed, withdrawn. The mother voice pulling back its attention the way a hand pulls back from a fire. And Tavasha understood. Lying broken in a Texas wheat field, under a sky still flickering with the dying light of her own people's warships, that somewhere above her, the harvest schedule had finally, catastrophically, updated. Correction, target reclassification, Terra, hostile, non-viable. Dara, abort. 9,000 cycles without losing a homeworld, and the hatching had not lost this one either. Not technically, they had never held enough ground to call it lost. They had simply discovered, in the space of a single Texan afternoon, that the harvest had teeth, and the teeth had names. And the teeth had been quietly cleaning their rifles on porches across an entire planet for longer than the hatching scouts had bothered to notice. She woke up in a tent that smelled of antiseptic and cut grass, restrained at all four limbs to a cot too small for her frame. With a human in pale green fabric standing over her, holding a device that hummed against her exposed nerve cluster in a way that, after a moment of confused panic, she realized was treating it rather than hurting it. For a long while she said nothing, because there was nothing in 9,000 cycles of hatching doctrine that prepared a drone for being tended. Two by the same species she had been issued to harvest. She lay still and watched the canvas ceiling ripple faintly with the wind outside, and listened to the low murmur of voices beyond the tent flap. Tired voices, human voices, talking about ordinary things. Whether the generator would last the night, whether anyone had heard from a unit called the 212, whether there was any more coffee. It was the ordinariness of it that undid her, more than the silence in the hive link, more than the pain still humming dull and distant beneath the medic's device. An invasion had ended on this ground less than a day ago. And somewhere outside this tent, people were already arguing gently about coffee. "You're stable," the human said, in a voice translated half a second late through a small device clipped to her collar. Tavasha would learn later it was called a turp box, military surplus. Repurposed for exactly this situation more times in the last week than its designers had ever imagined necessary. "Don't try to move. You lost a lot of mass." Tavasha did not understand for several long seconds why she was being treated at all. The hatching took prisoners only when prisoners had data value and processed them efficiently once that value was extracted. She had no data value. She was a drone. Drones were not debriefed, they were replaced. "Why?" she managed, the translator catching the rasp of her voice and turning it into a single, flat human syllable. The medic, a young woman tired-eyed, sleeves rolled up over forearms still faintly streaked with someone else's blood, looked at her for a long moment. "Because you're not dead yet," she said. "And we don't generally finish the job once somebody's down. Even somebody who came down out of the sky to eat my neighbors." It was, Tavasha thought, the single most confusing sentence she had heard in 9,000 cycles of inherited hatching memory. And she turned it over for a long time afterward in the quiet of the medical tent. While outside the canvas walls, she could hear human voices laughing about something, low and easy, the particular sound of people who had been certain 3 days ago that they might not live to laugh again. They let her outside on the 4th day, under guard, mostly, she suspected, because the camp had run out of room to keep prisoners isolated. The hatching had not expected prisoners. The hatching had not expected to need a category for surrendered at all. What she saw, blinking in the white Texas sun, was not the orderly military operation the Hivelink had once projected onto her threat models. It was something stranger, and she was beginning to understand. Far more dangerous. A sprawl of canvas and pickup trucks and folding tables loaded with coffee urns. Soldiers in matching uniforms standing shoulder to shoulder with civilians in jeans and ball caps, and one man, improbably, still in the apron from what she gathered was a barbecue restaurant, all of them moving with the same unhurried, settled confidence, as though the previous 4 days had been an inconvenience rather than an invasion. A boy, young by human standards, maybe a third of his expected lifespan along, sat near her holding pen on an overturned bucket, eating something out of a paper wrapper, watching her with frank curiosity rather than fear. "You guys really didn't know, huh?" he said, not unkindly. The translator caught it and rendered it flat and strange in her own language. "Know what?" Tavasha said. He shrugged, took another bite. That we'd shoot back. She didn't have an answer for that. The boy's name, she learned over the following weeks, was Dale. And he came by the holding pen most afternoons with no clear assignment to do so, which she gathered was simply something humans did when a thing interested them. They did not wait to be told it was permitted. He told her in pieces what the orbital battle had looked like from the ground, the sky going strange colors at night for 3 days straight, the distant thunder that wasn't thunder, the way the whole county had gathered at the grain co-op afterward, not to celebrate, exactly, but to count who hadn't come back. He told her about Cody and the silo, and about a woman 2 farms over who'd lost her husband and both sons in the first hour and had spent the second hour reloading magazines for everyone who came through her kitchen, because, as she'd reportedly said, crying can wait, the line can't. He did not tell these stories like victories. He told them the way T. Kavasha imagined a species told stories about a flood, or a fire, something terrible that had happened to them, that they had survived by doing what needed doing, with no particular pride in the doing of it. "You're not what I figured," Dale said one evening, watching the sun go down orange and enormous over the wheat. "Figured you'd all be like, I dunno, like the messages they intercepted. All that biomass for processing talk." "We do not think the way you think," Tavasha said carefully. The translator had gotten good enough by now to catch the effort in her voice. "I did not choose this war. I was given to it. Most of my brood cluster did not understand until the very end that there was a difference between a war you choose and a war you are simply issued." Dale was quiet for a while. "It's about the saddest thing I ever heard a bug say. I am not a," Tavasha started, and stopped, because she had decided, somewhere in the last 4 days. Some fights were not worth having, and this was one of them. The formal surrender talks happened in a hangar she never saw, conducted by humans she never met, between representatives of a mother voice that had, for the first time in 9,000 cycles, agreed to negotiate rather than simply withdraw and recalculate. She learned about it the way she learned about most things now, secondhand, through Dale, or through the rotating cast of soldiers and medics who had stopped treating her as a threat sometime around the second week and started treating her as simply a very large and very strange permanent fixture of the camp. The numbers, when they finally reached her, were numbers the hatching had never produced before in its long harvest history. 88% losses across the landing force. 60% losses to the orbital warspires. An entire generation of noble broods, the closest thing the hatching had to aristocracy, wiped out in a single afternoon over a planet that had been rated by every scout report filed in the last 40 cycles as low resistance, comparable to median harvested world. You know what gets me, Dale said, the day the numbers came through? Turning an unlit cigarette over in his fingers the way Tavasha had noticed he did when he was thinking, rather than smoking, is y'all really thought we'd just let you? Like nobody told you different? Someone tried to tell us, Tavasha said. Tavasha soughed the VR and warned the outer scouts away from human space for cycles. Quietly, we did not listen. I do not think the mother voice has the capacity to listen to small species. Talking about other small species. It has only ever had the capacity to calculate. And now. Tavasha considered the question for a long moment. Watching the wheat move in the wind the way it had moved the night she'd nearly died in it, indifferent and golden and utterly unconcerned with the affairs of empires. Now, she said, I think the calculation has changed. She still didn't have a clean answer weeks later. When the formal surrender negotiations concluded and the scattered remnant of the swarm fleet, 12% of its original strength, the worst losses in the hatching's recorded history, limped back through the threadways carrying. For the first time in 9,000 cycles, not a harvest, but a lesson. And Tavasha, against every doctrine she had ever been issued, chose to stay behind and make sure that lesson was the right one. 6 months later, Tavasha stood on her own 4 legs. Fitted with a prosthetic thorax plate, a human engineer had built for her out of the same composite they used on their fighter hulls. Because apparently that was simply a thing humans did once you'd stopped trying to eat them in a converted hangar outside. What had once been a launch site and was now something the locals called, with the particular dry humor she'd come to recognize as a planet-wide trait, the embassy, such as it is. The boy from the holding pen, taller now, leaned against the doorframe, eating from a different paper wrapper. "You're really going to go talk to your hive thing? Tell it what you saw?" "Someone has to," Tikavasha said. The translator had gotten better at catching the dry note in her voice. 9,000 cycles of harvest doctrine. Not one line of it accounted for a teenager with a deer rifle holding a grain silo by himself for 6 hours. Cody, the boy said, held it with his cousin too. "Don't let him tell you different. He likes to leave that part out." Tavasha didn't fully understand the joke. She was beginning to understand that this, too, was something humans simply did, found small true things to laugh about, in the wreckage of large, terrible ones, and kept going anyway. The hatching had spent 9,000 cycles learning how to calculate a species down to its breaking point. Earth, it turned out, had spent considerably less time teaching itself never to have one.